rapidly urbanizing areas. Two of our presenters will be looking at case studies in sub-Saharan Africa, one in Angola and the other in South Africa, while our third presenter will be discussing informal settlements in Nanjing, China. It will be interesting to compare and contrast the issues at play in these very different contexts. In particular, we're interested in lessons learned and in best practices. And we're also going to be looking at things from different perspectives. So two of our presenters have been trained as architects, while the third is a planner. We'll run through each of the presentations, all of which have been pre-recorded, and we'll have a brief break between them while we introduce the next speaker. And after we've heard from all three presenters or watched all three presentations, we'll have time for discussion. At any time during the presentation, you're encouraged to post questions in the chat room. During the discussion period, we'll also encourage you to turn on your cameras, raise your hands if you'd like to ask a question out loud. But normally we'd ask you to keep yourself muted. So our first presenter this afternoon in the case of South Africa is George Onatu. And George is a lecturer in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Johannesburg in Johannesburg, South Africa, where he headed the department from 2010 to 2016. He's an experienced researcher and consultant with numerous publications, both locally and internationally. He's a board member of several organizations, including the Association of African Schools, member of the Asian Pacific Association of Housing Research, and a member of ICCCASU and SAPI. And George will be presenting a paper that he co-authored with his colleague Didibuku Thwala and Clinton Agbabwa, both of whom are in the Department of Construction Management and Quantity Surveying at the University of Johannesburg. And the title of George's presentation, and George is with us live here, but the title of George's presentation is Mixed Income Housing Development Framework for South Africa using the Delphi method, a case study of Cornubia, eThekwini, and Cosmo City in Johannesburg. So Michelle, I think over to you, and we will watch George's presentation.
I'm Dr. George Onatu, and I'll be making this presentation together with my colleague, Professor Didibuku Thwala. Both of us are from the Faculty of Engineering and Built Environment, Department of Urban and Regional Planning, University of Johannesburg, South Africa. These are our presentations outline, introduction and purpose of the study. We shall equally be looking at aims and objectives, research questions and problem statement, literature review and key findings. We'll look at case study areas, then methodology, which comprises of Delphi approaches, findings and results, then finally, conclusion and recommendation. As part of the introduction and purpose of this study, the concept housing has witnessed a number of paradigm shifts and innovative approaches in an effort to addressing the challenges of informal settlement upgrade, as well as ability to address issues of local economic development and climate change. And this cut across all regions, as well as both developed and developing countries. The housing policies and strategies as it is formulated and implemented in the developed world are guided by social, cultural, and political consideration. Another issue relates to the issue of the right to housing, and this has been a very contentious issue, both in housing debate and research, and is associated with a lot of other social as well as economic rights, which includes as well housing, which form the basis of our research. Aims and objectives. We shall be looking at the linkage between urban land use planning and housing policies. We shall equally be looking to find out the extent of intergovernmental support and collaboration in a mixed income housing development project. We equally want to find out why is it that mixed income housing at times is faced with a lot of challenges and difficult to implement. Research questions and purposes. The first research question is, could a selected group of housing experts and professionals, as well as developers, reach consensus using the Delphi technique on the key principles and components of mixed income housing development? The second research question is, how significant is intergovernmental collaboration and support towards the achievement of these delivery objectives? And we shall equally be looking at the linkage between urban planning strategies and housing delivery in the response to mixed income housing approach. We consulted a couple of literatures while we are equally investigating this topic. One of the scholars, Quinkly and Raphael, in one of their research, they actually focus on affordability in the US America, which they argue that concerns of the people when it comes to housing should be viewed from multiple sources. According to these scholars, they equally wanted to note that the monetary expenditures, which tables out both the individual and families in today's world, according to their findings, most families in Europe as well as in the United States set aside about 25% of their annual income to housing-related issues. Mixed income housing development took a hold across the United States as an urban development strategy. According to Bennett, it is equally noted that mixed income housing in the United States is an attempt to undo years of hostility, racial segregation, and discrimination in housing. Smith, in his own study, looked at mixed income housing, which it attributes that owes much of its resurgence in America to the following factors. 1, adverse effect of concentration of poverty. 2, poor perceived quality of subsidized housing. And lastly, shortage of affordable housing. One view of mixed income housing development is that they are equally a type of housing typology that can reach in terms of building quality housing, which its intention is to rebuild urban neighborhood. These are the two case studies we use in these particular studies. One is Conubia, then the other one is Cosmos City. Starting with Conubia. This is a fully integrated mixed income housing. Mixed income housing in the sense that this housing project comprises of the low income earners, which in South Africa we look at people with 0 income to 3.5 income. Then you equally look at middle income between 3.5 thousand rand to 22,000 rand. Then you equally look at bond houses as well as above. Then Conubia equally comprises of partnership between Etiquette Municipality and Tongaat Hellat, which is a private sector. So it's basically a combination of public-private partnership. Then with regards to Cosmos City, this is a greenfield development which comprises of city of Johannesburg, Carleton province, and the private sector, and equally constitute almost about 1,100 hectares, whereas Conubia is in a specific extent of 1,300 hectares. The methodology and approach which we use in this study, we equally looked at research to start with as a voyage of discovery, because it is a combination of experience and reasoning undertaken within most professions. The approach which we equally adopted using the Delphi looked at consensus among experts. They equally used the case study, which according to Yin is an empirical inquiry that investigates a contemporary phenomenon within a real-life context, especially when the boundaries between phenomenon and context are most especially not clearly evident or shown. The Delphi approach, according to studies, is known to be that technique which assists in terms of obtaining the most reliable consensus of opinion of group of experts by a series of intensive questionnaires as well as iterations which fall within control opinion feedback. Our approach is that we use 3 levels of iteration: first questionnaire, second questionnaire, and the last questionnaire. Then in our findings and results, when asked to comment on the concern that delay and long process in getting town planning approval and adherence to land use regulation is having on mixed income housing development project, the response which we receive from the experts shows that about 75% of the strongly agree on this particular comment, and only about 25% agree. We did not get any response from the other items in the questionnaire. So in these particular findings, majority of the experts, which constitute about 70%, equally strongly agree that the delay in town planning approvals and adherence to land use regulations equally impact to a great extent to mixed income housing development. When we asked in terms of whether it is necessary for strong and good intergovernmental relations and coordination in the delivery of mixed income housing development, our result shows that 100% of the respondents strongly agree that it is very imperative for there to be very strong and good intergovernmental relations and coordination. This is quite a very important remarkable findings in this research because we have seen in the past whereby different government departments tend to operate and work in silos. So this particular finding shows that there is need for intergovernmental collaborations as well as relations. Conclusion and recommendations. Our survey result is also supported by evidence from case study, as the entire relevant government department played very major part in the delivery of this housing, those Conubia and as well as Cosmo City. Because in this project, it was equally revealed that various government departments such as the Transport Department, Education, Development Planning, Human Settlements, Health, Safety, as well as Security Services, that all of them played very major part, especially in the development of these 2 case housing projects. Comments from the respondents also suggest that it is necessary to address the housing challenge in South Africa, such as inclusion, integration, and construction, as well as good governance. South Africa has gone through a very past and difficult history of apartheid. So this particular finding shows that mixed income housing can go a long way to addressing the socioeconomic problem currently experienced in terms of housing delivery. There is also preconditions for sustainable mixed income housing development and replication. So our finding shows that with regards to the issues of the past history, that mixed income housing can go a long way in assisting in terms of inclusivity. The comments received from one of the respondents shows that the landscape will change with the introduction of SPLUMA. So one of the respondents expresses that the new planning legislation, which we classify as Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, will equally have a very significant impact in mixed income housing development, because the SPLUMA actually touches on the integration of planning and human settlement. So since one of our findings touches on town planning and regulations, we have that view that with the new planning legislation, it will equally open up a lot of opportunities with regards to mixed income housing development. These are the articles which we consulted while we are embarking on this research. And that is the end of our presentation. And I thank you people for listening.
Thank you so much, George. We look forward to discussing the paper as when we finish the presentations. So we'll now turn to our second presenter, and this is Kareem Mitchell. Kareem is an intern architect at Hoban. Oops, let me see. I've actually written another thing here. Yes. Our next presenter will be Kareem Mitchell, who recently completed his Master of Architecture degree at Carleton University in Canada, where he was a teaching fellow in the 2021 year. And Kareem is currently working as an intern architect at Hoban Architecture in Ottawa. And the title of Kareem's presentation is Housing on the Horizon, Low-Rise, High-Density Housing Strategy for Luanda's Expanding Periphery. So over to you, Michelle. And we'll run through Kareem's presentation.
Mitchell, and thank you for attending my thesis Housing. Hi, my name is Kareem Mitchell, and thank you for attending my thesis Housing on the Horizon for the 2021 International Conference on Canadian, Chinese, and African Sustainable Development. I will talk to you today about my project, which looks towards creating design strategies for affordable housing on the periphery of Luanda, Angola's capital city. The site is a 2-hectare plot of land in Pangila, about 30 to 40 minutes from the city center. Among other things, the project attempts to address challenges associated with low-density sprawl. Low-density informal development is a problem for cities in developing nations. Urbanization is happening rapidly in some of the most populous and least urbanized areas, notably Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. Over half of the world's population live in urban areas. This proportion is expected to increase to about 68% by the year 2050, which means massive amounts of people are moving into cities. For this reason, demand for housing in sub-Saharan African cities is high and expected to grow. Angola is one of the fastest urbanizing countries in Africa. There are massive wealth gaps in the population, and over 90% of the population are reported to living in poor conditions, with limited access to sanitation, water, and electricity in urban areas. Luanda was designed to accommodate a colonial population of about 300,000. Post-colonial Luanda today is now home to over 8 million people. The bulk of housing that supported this increase is self-built and informal. Luanda's expansion happened during 2 major periods of time. This expansion happened with minimal investment into housing and urban infrastructure. The first major period of expansion happened during 27 years Civil War. Populations were pushed into cities to escape conflict. The second expansion happened after the war. Migrant populations were drawn into the cities in search of greater opportunity. In Luanda, population expanded from 3 million to over 8 million, an increase of some 5 million peoples. During both periods of expansion, formal housing markets were virtually non-existent. As a consequence, housing in Luanda is largely comprised of one-story, low-density, self-built dwellings. Most of these houses have no access to municipal infrastructure, and residents have no title to their property. It is tough to address the legacy of post-war housing shortages. In the absence of a formal housing market, it has fallen to the government to address this problem, and they have done this mainly through multi-unit housing urbanization projects, new centralities, and relocation settlements. The bulk of these projects have been undertaken by foreign contractors, financed through loans against oil revenues. The goal of my project is to kickstart formal housing markets for moderate income households with the characteristics of formal and informal housing. Here are some examples of centrality projects. In 2009, the government of Angola launched a national housing urbanism program to address accumulated housing shortages. You can see at the top image, Kalamba, which was a new paradigm for city building and housing. It was very quickly built. Below is Kapari, a centrality of low-rise housing, 20 minutes actually from my site. Controversies surround both of these projects. They are usually unaffordable and relatively unoccupied. Here are some examples of relocation sites, namely Pangila, where my project resides. The relocation sites were used to house informal settlers displaced by infrastructure projects near the urban core. And here are some examples of musecs, unplanned houses. A musec is a colloquial term applied to informal settlements that comprise the bulk of Luanda's urban fabric. The centralities and relocation sites are often located on the periphery of the city, and the musecs grow outward from the city center. As for socioeconomic classes, existing formal private housing markets service primarily the affluent. In this graph, you can see it as class A and B. Government initiatives have largely serviced upper middle incomes. Class C on this diagram was the exception of relocation sites. As a result, some 90% of the population have no access to formal housing. My project aims to provide housing for the lower middle class demographic, i.e., you can see on this graph with marked with that cross, class D. As for approaches to urban development, the future of Luanda's growth depends on two things: what is done with what is already there, and two, how do we build differently in areas that have yet to be built out. My project investigates ways to create housing on the urban periphery. The project addresses issues concerning title. It tries to aim to formalize the housing market for moderate income households, build at higher densities, and blend formal planning with housing that supports informal economic activity and a flexibility of uses. The goal is to promote sustainable urban growth on the periphery of Luanda. I've worked on this project primarily with DW, the Development Workshop, an NGO that privately owns this site. DW sets targets and a number of units for the site, namely 325 units. This is at a density of 151 units per hectare, 151 UPH. All units are to be cross-ventilated and have one parking spot. There was quite a number of challenges associated with the site. First off, topography, it was quite steep. Second, there was a competition for space and program amongst the buildings, parking, open spaces, community facilities, and market housing. Third, there was a lack of municipal services, namely potable water, sanitary and storm sewers, and water management, and transportation could be a bit of an issue. As for my research approach, it can be divided into two portions: research and a design project. In order to get an understanding of the project, I conducted research through literature reviews of precedents for affordable housing and multi-unit housing in Angola and elsewhere, ongoing discussions with the Development Workshop, site visits and fieldwork, and I explored alternatives to multi-unit housing through design. On my site, I took photographs of neighborhood elements and dissected them by examining the various settlements on site and housing types of high and low end housing from my visit in Luanda. I set out to identify which features and considerations were most relevant to my design project for Pengila. Next, I took a look at precedents for formal housing and applied it to my site to see what is applicable. I made a catalog of figure grounds of neighborhood types I visited in Luanda and superimposed them onto my site. This was done to compare density and to determine the appropriate amount of density for my site. Most formal housing and informal housing in Luanda is relatively low in density. My target is 151 UPH with a target of 325 units. This image shows the density of existing Pengila neighborhoods superimposed onto my site, and you can visualize how relatively low density the developments there are in Pengila. Another example shows the nearby multi-unit housing centrality project north of my site, Kapari. As you can see, most existing developments are much less in unit count, with 72 units fitting on my site with the Kapari buildings when I need a total of 325 units. I also had a look at precedents outside of Angola, namely Brickfield, an affordable housing project in South Africa. I studied this one, which came relatively close to my target density when superimposed onto my site. From there, and with all the resources I have considered above, I explored ways of organizing my organizing units for my multi-story housing. I looked at 4- and 5-story options. A 5-story skip-stop townhouse was chosen for a typical module. This limits the number of stories residents are required to walk up to access their units, with a total of 5 units per module. Next, I explored options for street and block design. I chose to organize buildings around courtyards. I then evaluated the courtyard configurations based on their ability to define shared space. The inward facing U-shaped blocks were the best to accommodate community activity and pedestrian paths. Next, I divided the site into 5 blocks to meet the unit and parking targets. The building modules are comprised mainly of 3-bedroom, 2-story units on levels 4 and 5, 2-bedroom flats on level 3, and a 3-bedroom, 2-story unit on level 1 and 2. To accommodate the slope, the uphill lower townhouses are accessed from the courtyard level on level 1 at street, and the downhill lower townhouses can be accessed from the courtyard at street and the street as well. The corners of the building consist of flats. Uphill flats are accessed from the courtyard level, 1 level above a retail unit at street level, and downhill flats, lower townhouses can be accessed from the street and the courtyard. Here is an example of a typical courtyard building configuration. Above the corner flats on the 3rd and 4th floor are common spaces. These align with the main corridors. They are also common spaces on the 4th floor as well. As some of you may have noticed, I have also put solar arrays on the roof. Although it is likely the site will be connected to a municipal power grid, electric services is sporadic in Angola. Water tanks were also placed on the roof that could be serviced by a water truck. And here are some images of the courtyards, an image of the leisure space being used for drying laundry, and a leisure space occupied by residents. And here's a view looking off of a balcony of one of the block configurations. On the site scale, the site was broken into 5 blocks connected by a continuous pedestrian path. A one-way street system with head and parking worked best to reach the parking targets. Parking was also placed beneath uphill units. The site also accommodates a variety of uses: courtyard retail units, community facilities, parking, and space for market-oriented development towards the main road of the site and block 1. And here's a section through the site along the pedestrian path from a 5-a-side field. And here's a view looking up from the 5-a-side field towards the main street through the path, the pedestrian path. And here's a view of the blocks from the pedestrian path. And next, I will talk about incrementality in my site. The goal of my project was to accommodate incremental growth. It aims to change to meet the needs of the community members. Incrementality became an important part of my project. I will show you some ways I thought about highlighting, accommodating incrementality in my project. Was the highlighted garages at grade. Here shows an elevation of some uphill units. And here I highlight the parking garages at grade. And over time, I show that when car dependencies decrease for this site, these parking garages can transition into stores. And here are some views at these stores that have been transitioned. Some views of the blocks and stores as well, and some views of the terraces that let light in to the units. And looking, here's some more vignettes of some market activity. Next, I will talk about how to adapt the units at street level. Here you can see the ground floor of a townhouse at street level, and many variations of how it can accommodate a retail unit. In a potential variation, the unit's living room could be transformed into a retail space. Others may be subdivided into additional bedrooms. Smaller street-oriented retail spaces may also benefit from a payment window for quick transactions. Now I will speak about adapting the upper floors of the townhouse. This can be done through the enclosure of terraces with panels. The terraces provide a connection to the outdoors, but once they are enclosed, they can be additional bedrooms. You can see this with the variations. And here's a visual of that. The terraces being enclosed to create an additional bedroom. Next, I will touch on the build strategies for the sites. So I thought of 2 strategies. In the first strategy, starting with the community center block, in this option, block 5, which includes 72 units, a community center, school, and a 5-a-side field would be the first to be constructed. Launching the project with block 5 may be more attractive to buyers to facilitate community development. And option 2, the revenue generated from doing block 3 first could be used to subsidize the creation of the other blocks. And both approaches, the block towards the main road would be the last to be built and can be used to accommodate a potential transport hub. And now I'll close here with some vignettes. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
And Kareem, I think I talk fast. That was that was extremely quick, but you got a lot in there very quickly. So good on you. Yeah, great. So Michelle will now move to our third presenter. Let me pull up my Word file here. And our third presenter today is Gianni, and Gianni is a PhD candidate at Southeast University in Nanjing, China. Gianni holds a bachelor's degree from Southeast University and a master's degree in architecture from the Technical University of Munich in Germany. And as his area of studies deals with the structure of Chinese residential statutes, he returned to Nanjing to pursue his PhD in the School of Architecture at Southeast University. So again, education divided between China and Germany, and now back in China to look specifically at statutes and their impact on housing there. Zhu will be presenting a paper entitled Young Yanghuakang, I hope I said that correctly, which is an informal settlement in Nanjing as a case study. So we're going to take a look at this and compare and contrast how informality manifests itself in China and what some of the urban issues are there with what we've been seeing in Africa. So over to you, Michelle, and we will play Zhu's presentation.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Yu Liu. I'm a PhD student from South University. Today, my topic is Yanhuchang semi-formal settlement. Informal settlement was not always informal. This paper maps the special patterns of Yanhuchang semi-formal settlement in Nanjing to discover how it functions and why it became current structure. The research was based on the first-hand material, such as cadastral cards. So in this paper, the changing process helped sense semi-formal settlement under the influence of limited municipal policies, and the informal rent market was interpreted and analyzed. This place was a city village outside the ancient city wall of Nanjing. In the 1990s, the villagers were granted homestay certificates by local government. Their houses in the village were constructed according to the house courtyard prototype, which was usually seen in traditional Chinese countryside. In the 1990s, the adjacent lawns were being radically planned and modernized to host lots of middle-rise residential building, while this place was somehow neglected. Meanwhile, the spatial structure of Yanhuchang was more and more compact, but still follow some certain potential orders. The spatial structure of this place appeared to be like informal settlements out of reasons of different aspects, especially when this area went through the special rapid developing period in China. The institutional aspects, such as plot properties, the rent market, land tenure policies, etc., plays important roles. The link between the spatial features and the institutional aspects could be studied through this case in order to help us to understand the interaction between the morphology and these institutional courses. The topic today will be divided into 5 pieces. There are already some research about the informal settlement, about the courses of informal settlement, and about the influence of the informal settlement. But there are no clear research about the settlement which is not informal and which is not formal. So Yanhuchang gave us the possibility to see what could be the reasons of this semi-formal settlement. As for the background of Yanhuchang, this place was named Yanhuchang because it used to be the place where the emperor fed his tigers. After the establishment of People's Republic of China, this place was still a rural area. Nowadays, this place is a relatively enclosed area near the city center, with only one entrance on the east. It is separated from the district by roads and small hills. There are middle-rise residential buildings all around, so the development of this area have more independent features. The general appearance of Yanhuchang was close to slum, while the spatial construction seen above looked unorganized and chaotic. The low-cost material used for the roofs, the windows, and etc. contributes to the slum atmosphere. This is the overlook of the whole area. As for the methodology, the first one you see a way of mapping the cadastral card. This is the method which the ancient Chinese and ancient Italian have been used to govern the city. Normally, it was used for the clear or formal settlement in urban district. It was seldom used to analyze the informal settlement because the situation was much more complicated and didn't was doing it. So it could easily causes conflict among the residents if they want to do this investigation for the cadastral card. But this place was different because it was not pure informal settlement. The relationship of each resident was not chaotic like the informal one. And with some as municipal behavior certain years ago, some land use certificate could be found and used as a fundamental material. Other methods including modeling the place and interview with locals and done questionnaire surveys with locals and trying to find about information in the historical chronography. As for the spatial features and structures, the first one, it has this kind of migrant culture. Although this place locates near the city center, life here is quite different. According to the questionnaire which done with the local, most of residents here are tenants who came from small poorer town near the city. They lived here simply because of low rent and could access to the jobs, but the job is low paid and manual labor jobs. Although the place where the resident lived was not the same, having moved from small towns and villages, the residents here still maintain their way of living. Social public space could be found near the wells that people used water to wash their clothes. Such place is all over inside these regions. With the help from local municipal department, we managed to map the current cadastral card of this place. The spatial structure could be seen through the cadastral card. Surprisingly, the boundary of each plot is quite clear, although the shape of which is irregular. What could be the reasons to explain the relative clarity of boundary of plot lies at the property rights. Even with many tenants who came from different towns, the house and plot still belongs to the landlords. With this irregular shape of each individual plot, the public space of Yanhuchang purchases the feature of flexibility, narrowness, but still obtain accessibility to each plot. Each individual plot owns its own way to public area. Although it seemed that the public realm was encroached, there are still some small public spaces around. The boundary of public realm was created by the shape of each plot. This is the cadastral card which were mapped under the help from the local municipal department. When we turn to Gideon's theory to figure out the formation of Yanhuchang, the difficulty lies at the definition of houses inside the boundary of each plot. For the landowner, it is important for them that the illegal construction could be accepted by the officials so they could make more profit. So the current house is a mixture of different parts. The official recognized formal part and the informal part. However, the land belongs to National Certificate Countryside Homestead. This is not for sale. It couldn't be sale, but it could be inherited. There are also kind of unique traffic system of Yanhuchang inside the plot of each individual land tenure. This unique traffic system applied in within one houses or of 2 or 3 houses. So each individual room was connected to this public stairs, which also connect to the public space. There are also diagrams about the types of combination of 2 houses and 3 houses. So the contrast between the clarity of cadastral card and the mixed living and traffic system of houses has made itself clear that Yanhuchang was not simply an informal settlement nor a formal settlement. It obtained the features of informal settlement, organized complexity, providing low-cost shelter to urban poor, etc. It also possesses the feature of formal settlement, land use certificate, still controlled over through the regulation, etc. So I try to use the semi-formal settlement here to emphasize the status in between. Process of institutional perspective. A certificate homestead is a special land use. According to the current regulation, it is not permitted to sell land to others and also not permitted to construct new buildings or change the function of the existing houses. It could be accepted when homestead was in countryside, when it located inside a big city. demanding for more residential area could naturally lead to area into in-between situation where houses without permission were being built to satisfy the need for living. Laws and norms of homestead were not clear at that time. Permitted houses and not permitted houses were along each other inside each homestead. However, due to the special land use, it couldn't be sold in the formal market. It could be rented through the informal rent market. The formation from the perspective of institution could be simplified as follow chart. At first, the municipal department granted homestead holder certificate, which means they own land with limited rights. And due to this kind of limited rights, land couldn't be sold. Homestead holders sought informal rent market to gain profit. And this led to nowadays condition of this place. The houses of Yanghuang was gradually turned into renting usage due to the higher demand for more renting area. The homestead certificate holder built more houses to host more tenants. The special patterns of Yanghuang couldn't maintain the traditional way anymore. More houses were being built. Land used to be courtyard. Streets were also encroached. The left space could only keep the function for fundamental traffic. The area became compactor and crowded. Although limited by the house, the homestead holder makes each room separated from each other and directly linked to the public space through the public staircase. This behavior has led to discretion of each individual tenant. Outdoor stairs are being built in order to satisfy the requirement of this individuality. Because of this requirement for social living, which the migrant used to have in their hometowns, the public space was used again to connect each tenant, no matter the public space was of one house, of many houses. So the reset of public space and discretion individuals contributes to the special structure of this place. There are also many other reasons, like the cultural perspective which the migrant had in their hometown, and also because of the low cost rent, this kind of economic aspect. Compared to the method of norms rules, which control the urban space directly, the method with limited rules would grant partial houses with limited rights to use. However, those houses with no permission still exist. Due to the special function for migrant tenants, new special structures form. Those shelters provided for migrant tenants were often desecrated as individual. So not all space of them were illegal. From this point of view, this kind of area could hardly be defined as formal or informal settlement, but obtain features of complexity and mixture, which shouldn't be considered from the traditional aspect. The institutional aspect couldn't be regarded as new important rule. It could be regarded as new important rule. Other aspects which influence the area also have certain relations with each other. Apparently, the institutional aspect could always be changeable, especially when applied in reality. It is functional like a net rather than function alone. It is hard to conclude the current special types could be considered as a middle status or could be represented somewhere again. The analysis of semi-formal settlement was more like an analytical process for reasons and progress. So the morphological features could not always be the fixed one. It changes all through time and obtain possibilities to internal renewal. But for every progress, the morphological structure was relatively stable. The stability could influenced by the institutional aspect and evolve themselves into a new status ready for the future changes. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Gianni. So I'm happy to begin the discussion today. Maybe we'll start with Gianni, and please raise your hands if you'd like to chime in, or probably we're all online together, so it's just easier to raise your hands, and we'll do it that way. And I'll keep my eye on who's got their hands raised. Gianni, okay, so Africa, the bulk of urbanization is accommodated through informal settlements. I think Kareem's project is really trying to look at how to formalize the informal, as it were, by actually devising or imagining a housing market which actually functions not for the upper 5%, but for a percentage of the population which is a bit lower and more moderate in income. And he's doing that on the periphery. In China, of course, lots of rural land was converted to urban land and was brought under the control of the urban municipality, presumably in this case, Nanjing. An artifact of China's history was that in the rural lands, people were actually given title to the land they owned. And when rural land was converted to urban, the villages associated with these rural areas remained in the ownership of the original village and ownership, and therefore are kind of outside of the municipal structure of the city which is around them now, right? And so, they have become, in some ways, what I want to say, performed a function for the floating populations which have no hukou status in Nanjing, and therefore don't have access to the formal rental housing market through the municipality. So they're performing a very important function. A lot of the cities in China have tried to get rid of them because they're a bit anomalies. They're not in line with China's vision for what cities should look like or how they should operate, and yet the cities don't really have an alternative. We heard from Gilles that in Shenzhen, the city is now starting not to get rid of these villages in the cities, but actually allowing them to continue to exist and to recognize the function they perform. You've done a really nice, really excellent, I should say, morphological analysis of this little area in Nanjing. What do you see the future of it? Is the city going to let it be? Is the city going to come in and try to regulate it on some level, but not others? In other words, are they going to look at the structural integrity of buildings? Are they going to put caps on how many people and what the density can be? Or are they just going to let it go? What's your sense of the future of this little area?
Okay, thanks to Professor Gianni. Actually, this place is quite a lot in China. It's actually in Nanjing, especially which was used to be the rural area. So I guess for the government now, they're trying to do some kind of example for the future. So this place is like the project we have done inside our studio. We try to study the history of this plot and see what behind the plot is. There's like a municipal reasons, or like there's like some kind of hidden norms behind this morphology. So it's actually about doing this as an example to try to figure out how it functions and why it become the current status. So actually, I guess for the future, the places like Yanghu-san couldn't be all, removed. It must be somehow renewed and regenerated. So in China, the old way is like to delete all this place and try to build like a high density and high-rise building for department, for the apartment. But now they try to figure out, could it be possible to try to maintain this kind of spatial patterns, to maintain this kind of lifestyle. They now treasure it as some kind of like historical memories. So I guess so in the future it might be some more example like this.
Like a Xintandi, it'll get gentrified and become a little yeah. Pocket of old vernacular in Nanjing, or do they see its function? You could look at it from a heritage function, that's for sure, because it does represent a kind of heritage asset. But it also performs this function of a place for migrant workers to live. And there's a lot of money being made on these places as well. So how is the city viewing it? Is it saying it's a necessary evil in some ways because accommodations for the floating populations can't be made within the formal municipal housing market? Or is it saying, does it see it as a heritage asset? What does it, does it see it gentrifying ultimately? Or what are you imagining? It looks like your research is really kind of getting ready to try to understand what's there in order to get ready to move forward with a different approach. But what do you think that approach is?
Actually, gentrification, is always the problem. Like if they try to regenerate these areas, the rent must, could be higher, and it would be not affordable for the poor people, for like the tenants anymore. So it's actually the aim, I guess, is not to, to make this place like a luxury place like the Xintiandi area in Shanghai. Is try to just to make the houses more stable and try to like give some kind of formal certificate to the landowners. So it's actually I must say, because this place locates, often locates inside the city center, so the rent couldn't always be so low. I must say, in the future, this place couldn't be, stay in this lower rent level.
Yeah,
so,
I see.
But we try to, to maintain this, relatively lower rent for the tenants.
Right. That's really interesting. Alan, or David, or anyone else who has some familiarity with VICs in China, do you want to weigh in on this? I like what Jiu is saying. If its location makes it, in effect, and its anomaly, its kind of heritage assets make it, in effect, a potential Xintiandi, and that ultimately a place this central cannot continue to accommodate migrant, floating populations. It's too well placed and too important on so many other levels to continue to function that way. So the question is what it becomes, and the question is that what do you do to accommodate the floating populations if you're not going to accommodate them there, I guess. Anybody want to weigh in? Alan?
Yes. My question is really about what is the status of the rights of people? I guess we have a situation of the rights of the homestead owners, or the
Village council.
People in the village, and the rights of the tenants. What does tenure? What value or what weight does tenure right have? Versus the expropriation rights of a municipality.
Jiu, do you want to try to answer that?
I must say that in China, like 20 years ago, there was not like even official official certificate for the land tenure, in the countryside. So those people, they share like the land, they're granted this land homestay certificate. But this kind of certificate is not like, this land is for you. This just means that you have the right to use this land. The land belongs to the countries. So it's actually when the cities is much more bigger. So this place is like become the city center, or becomes I guess the government is now trying to to give the landowners the official one, like they could use the land, but actually I have to say that the tenant, like the migrant, couldn't be so much considered, because the landowner had his own rights to use the land, I guess. I don't know because this place is complicated, because this countryside homestay system is not always functional, I guess.
Really interesting question. I guess I'm going to change the topic a little bit. You're mostly documenting what's there, which I think is extremely important. You're trying to understand what it was historically and how it's transformed over time, by way of sort of establishing a trajectory for what it might become, or how its function might change. But you're trained as an architect. And I can tell that in the way you're drawing and the way you're seeing it and the way you're evaluating. You're not evaluating it from a policy perspective. You're evaluating it really from a formal perspective, which is good. Kareem also is an architect. And I'm just wondering if we can talk, maybe Alan, you can, and David, you could talk, what is the role of architects in looking at these places as opposed to politicians or policy people? What perspective do you bring to solving issues or to suggesting new futures for these that might be different than someone from a different discipline? Kareem, you can feel free to answer that as well.
Yes, I mean, I was going to actually refer this to Kareem. I think what Kareem did in his analysis was interesting, and he was looking, and George can probably back this up. He looked at the example of brick fields in Johannesburg as an example, and also, I mean, there one has a kind of community medium density, well, actually relatively high density housing at very low cost, and walk up basically units, but well designed and well planned. But also the innovation from looking at medium density incremental building, and that's a model that I think one needs to look at Addis Ababa and the massive housing projects that have been done in Ethiopia in recent years on the similar scale to Angola and South Africa, but at very low cost, using local contractors, local artisans, and allowing eventual owners to actually complete the units. So it was there's a lot of innovation in making housing available to the lower middle class. Affordable housing. I mean, that's the issue here. Most of what is called social housing in Angola, huge amount I'm going to be talking about in the next session, is state highly subsidized housing. But these are some innovations that we can look to these kinds of projects where innovative solutions have been used to bring costs down to at least the lower middle class and maybe the better paid working class populations.
George, you have your hand up. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, Chair, I think I want to come in here that equally to touch on the need for them to actually to look at the planning, because I didn't see much of the planning regulation in the research. So I will encourage him to look at the planning regulation with regards to informality. And I equally want to guide to mention that we tend to mix up slum with informal settlement. When we are actually engaging in that discussion, we have to be very careful because slums are not informal. We try to differentiate between slums and informal settlement. Informal settlement is an illegal occupation of land. Illegal occupation of land, or what we call flight by night, people invading land, which does not belong to them. That land can belong to the private sector. That land can belong to the municipality, which he mentioned. Whereas somebody who have a title deed ownership can set up a structure which might look like a slum. So I want to guide him to know how to differentiate it. And part of the guidance, he has to look at UN Habitat Global Cities Report. You need to try to refer to that and equally look at some of the work which some of my colleagues, Jose Maya, has done in Horizonte in Brazil. So you should try to look at some of these critical examples to be able to build up his literature review and his argument very well. And another thing I equally want to encourage him, he equally need to look at, in terms of municipal ordinance, what are the planning regulations in particular case areas? Because the planning regulations will actually be in a position to guide him in terms of what is permissible, what type of density can be accommodated, and in terms of height, what type of height can as well be accommodated, especially since some of these villages are now becoming part of what we call urban development zone. So these are the things I want to guide him. And as part of this discussion, I equally has my email. I can equally send him a couple of articles which will guide him very well so that we'll make a very good distinction between informal settlement and slum. Yeah, I think that's my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, David.
Sure, thanks, Ben. I think your question about the role of architects in the kinds of exercises described by both Karim and Zayu is a very interesting one. It's hard to imagine, and this is not so much a question but a comment, but it's hard to imagine projects like those underway, for example, in the Canadian and maybe in the North American context, going to being awarded to architects who would be unable to present a convincing scenario for the consultation process with the residents and owners. You know, in the request for proposals that we see more and more, you know, the requirement to you know, to first of all design and then outline in detail the process in which the residents are engaged in the design process. It's become quite crucial. In our work in Beijing in the 90s, in the mid-90s, Ben, you and I have talked about this, I think, quite a lot. We saw a number of very interesting issues emerging, and we saw some in Beijing. We were able to work with some extremely talented architects involved in projects like the one Zayu describes in Nanjing, in the historic center of Beijing. Projects where the architects, when they were not able to preserve the physical housing, were able to preserve circulation patterns. In other words, they were able to maintain you know, circulation networks that connected a particular site to adjacent sites. We saw some remarkably inventive and I think still regarded as very successful projects.
Sort of high density, low rise projects.
Yes, not always low rise, you know, 4 to 6 stories. Projects,
right.
One of
mid-rise,
Shaohuang in Beijing, which I'm sure Zayu knows. Another one, Zohr Hutong in Beijing. But these, which we saw as models, the work we were doing in the 90s, were not regarded by the regulatory authorities as providing the kinds of densities they were seeking, which was revealing and of course very, very frustrating. The other issue, and I don't know how relevant it is to the project in Angola or in Nanjing, but the other issue that we dealt with was an issue referred to in the 90s called relocation. You know, I think one of our Chinese partners referred to a saying in Beijing, which translated roughly as relocation one step closer to heaven. But for us involved in these projects, the idea of relocation refers to the percentage of existing residents who would be provided access to the housing once rehabilitated, and that number was going down. Projects like Shaohuang, I think, were close to 100% occupied by the residents of the previous site, and by the time our involvement terminated in 1995-96, those rates of relocation had dropped precipitously. Yeah, as real estate values. Yeah, just a comment, but I thought both presentations were extremely sophisticated.
Yeah, I have to say, not having seen Karim's work for the last year or something, that quick run through it again, I'm sort of blown away on how comprehensive it is. Zayu, it's Oh,
Ben,
God.
just one last comment about
Yeah.
carrying. I'm going to run the tape at a slightly slower speed so I can get the.
Yes, indeed. Take it from whatever, to 45 down to 33, yeah. to use an old terminology that his generation wouldn't understand at all. Yeah, absolutely. I think what I'm compelled by your presentation, in as much as all of a sudden, the penny is dropping, and I'm thinking about Lilong in Shanghai, and these bits, these fragments that got left behind, which are extremely important as places for migrants to live, are also going probably to become really valued as cultural assets. And there will be massive, because they are the anomalies in some ways, this old fabric, the old China that still exists within the reconstructed city, and that there is going to be pressure not only to maintain them, but to restore them and to gentrify them. Strangely enough, these things which cities have been trying to get rid of are now going to become some of the things which are going to try hardest to preserve, assuming they're not. The current owners, of course, are ripping them apart and rebuilding them as we speak. But as you look at the cadastral patterns of them, these things are going to become really important assets, I think, which is an interesting, an interesting kind of 90-degree or 180-degree reversal on where China has been relative to all these things in recent years. So that's quite interesting. George, I was going to say, I just finished a very good book on the redevelopment of public housing in the US. And under the Hope 6 program in the US, you might be familiar with, there was a lot of pressure to turn single demographic, sort of deeply subsidized complexes of public housing into mixed income public housing. And there was a really good discussion in that book about what levels of income mixing make sense and why income mixing. I mean, we all say, what you really don't want is these pockets of deep poverty, which in effect become ghettos. But the idea of mixing income has always been about, providing the poor with role models, good middle class role models, and this book really talked about. It looked at 4 different case studies of these Hope 6 developments in the States that dealt with income mixing in various ways. And part of what it did is looked at what worked better and what didn't. And interestingly enough, the conclusion was that income mixing worked best when it was relatively shallow. In other words, you would take deeply subsidized and semi-subsidized and put them together, but you would never take deeply subsidized and put it with market units. It was just, the income was just way too far apart. People couldn't learn or even interact with each other, couldn't relate to each other. And that if you split the income difference too much, you lost a lot of that informal network where people are helping other people. So that, I just thought it was an interesting point that when you think about income mixing, you want to think about, first of all, how do you do it unit by unit? Do you do it building by building? Do you do it district by district within the same complex? And then the question of, how deeply or shallowly are those incomes mixed? Can you comment a little bit on your experience in South Africa about that?
Well, Ben, thanks. I would like to have an insight into that book. I think because I equally draw a couple of parallel examples from American example. What I want to mention with regards to the model which form part of our research is that we are looking at making some borrowing from example in terms of not making it to be too much mixed, but as equally taking into consideration developers' interest. So these particular 2 projects, what we're actually looking at is a kind of mixed income, because in terms of what we are actually mentioning, in terms of inclusionary housing, which actually tend to incorporate people of different income groups. So our approach is actually taking that route, looking at most of the previous housing projects in South Africa tend to marginalize the poor, or what we call the poorest of the poor, whereby most of the housing units are located at the periphery of the city. And the poor tend to spend a lot of money in order to come to the city, or equally in order to go to different areas.
Mm-hmm.
So the mixed income approach from our research is equally trying to create that spatial transformation of human settlement, whereby the poorest of the poor can live side by side with the middle income, together with the market-related units in terms of rental, as well as the upper cliff, what we call upper cliff, people of bond houses. So the approach is equally to borrow from American examples, which my next paper will equally be looking at those integration outcome, especially in terms of role model, because most of the poorest of the poor are people who are not. So we want to create a model whereby they can see how people wake up in the morning to go to work and
Right. Yeah.
you know, to try to.
Well, George, yeah, two things quickly. I think we're going to be cut off in about 3 minutes, so because we have got to give way to we've got to give this room over to the next panel. I did put in the chat room the book. It's called After the Projects by Lawrence Vail. And he does case studies, I think, for 4 Hope 6 redevelopments, which is, I think it'd be quite interesting to you. So that information is there for you. I recommend it to anybody who's interested in this. Yeah. Okay, great. So we, given that we've got to close up soon, I want to thank everybody. Julieu, Karim, and George, thank you so much for your presentations. We had an interesting discussion here today. It seems it's always good to cut off the discussion when it's still going. So I feel badly cutting it off, but it's a good time to cut it off. And I encourage everyone to stay on and participate in the next couple of sessions, which I think Alan will be participating in as well. So again, thank you to one and all, and we'll close off our session now. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, it's fine. Huh?